A while back, I had some friends ask me if I could build them a floating kitchen island. After quite some lengthy back and forth on the design and several iterations later, we reached a plan. After a trip to my favorite hardwood supplier for some fresh sticks, I marked out all my parts, roughly, on the boards and mathemated my way to the best use of each board. I milled down the lumber into approximate lengths and widths, ripping and planing down the faces from rough cut timber to dimensional ready lumber. Once I had everything close to size and surfaced relatively smooth, I was ready for the final cuts. I like to cut everything in batches based on the width. All the 2-inch pieces were ripped together, then the 3s, the 4s, and so on. Most of my parts can be grouped into sizes because most of the parts are 2, 3, 4, or 5 inches wide. I do have racks for this lumber, I just haven't put them together yet. I like to use my track saw to rip a nice clean edge before taking my parts over to the table saw. Even though I cut all these to the same width without moving the fence on my table saw, that does not guarantee accuracy with one of these job site saws. In fact, this $700 table saw, as good as it is, can only be about $700 accurate. It's just the truth of how things are. It's truly not designed for fine woodworking, that's construction at best. And I'm really pushing the limits when I do projects like this, so I don't hold it against the saw. Honestly, if DeWalt were to make a highly accurate cabinet saw, I'd be first in line. Well, near the front. Maybe not the first. Or the second. That being said, I am looking towards replacing this table saw soon. Once all the parts are sized correctly, it's time to sand. Grouping them together by width just makes it so much easier to sand everything together at once. I don't know why this is so satisfying, but I just love it. Anytime I have a tool in my hand, I can't help but reflect back upon those summers with my dad, driving around in his two-tone Dodge, iced tea in hand, Beach Boys on the radio, as he went around to different odd jobs around town, doing handyman work and various things. I learned a lot over those summers, things that I didn't know I would apply to my life today. Things like that the tool you have isn't nearly as important as the hands that hold it. A skilled carpenter can do just about anything with the most basic of tools. Now that I have everything cut to size, it's time to start assembling. I'll make these side panels first, the slat supports second, then everything will get built off of those. The side panels are no different than some large shaker-style cabinet doors, but with a fancy little twist. To start, I'm going to try some dowel joinery to strengthen these butt joints. It's my first attempt at dowel joinery, so don't hold it against me. I take my time and I'm sure to check everything twice to make sure that it fits tight. Some of the dowels were too tight. Either the dowel I bought and cut down was not entirely accurate, which I bought it at Home Depot, or the holes are slightly out of alignment. Again, this is my first time, so either way, it could be true. I decided the best bet was just to slim down the dowels over at my belt sander. And after I did that, they fit nice and snug. Gluing up the frame, the rails, and the stiles was simple. Start with pushing all the stiles into one rail with the glue. Then put the other rail on with glue and clamp it together. I clamp it up tight, but not too tight because I don't want to twist or bow this frame. I'll check that it's square and flat before I move on to the next one. Once those are dry, I cut a rabbet around the inside front face of the panel, squaring off all the corners with a little gorilla-style chisel work. Again, don't hold it against me. Hand tools are not my first go-to. If you click this video looking for expert chisel work, I'd be really curious to know what gave you the impression that I'm that skilled. Seriously, let me know below. What in the thumbnail told you you'd be expecting expert chisel work here? Anyways, once the rabbet is cleaned and cornered, not quartered. Again, wrong video. Once the rabbet is ready to receive the center panel, I'll need to cut it to fit. I always rough cut these a little larger than the final size I need. Then I trim them down to a snug fit. 1/4-inch plywood is very stable, and I haven't had a problem with movement in anything I've built with it. At me if you like below. I'm standing by that one. Once cut to size, I drop them into place. If you notice, the panel was pre-primed before I put it in. This is so if there's any movement after it all goes together and maybe a little crack develops along those edges, it'll be easier to touch up. Or you won't need to touch it up. Here's where things get a little interesting. Remember that special twist we talked about before? My friend wanted a very specific profile on the panels to match the new cabinets going into their kitchen. When I cut the rabbets on these panels, I cut them 1/2 inch deep into these 3/4 inch thick boards. With the 1/4 inch panel placed in the rabbet, I'll have a 1/4 inch between the panel and the board on both faces. So I cut a bunch of 45-degree strips from some of the scraps I had left over, just over a 1/4 inch tall. Then I trimmed them down with mitered edges to fit snugly along the inside of the panel. Then glued and brad nailed these into place to create this nice edge profile that they were looking for. Once it's sanded and painted, you'll never see the seams. Now I had to be careful here to shoot the brad nails back into the maple and not out the face of the panel. Picking the right size brads is very important here, and putting them in at the correct angle as well. Now I need to assemble the slat supports. The island has 2 shelves of slats, each supported by the same size frame. They're identical, just one's on top and one's on the bottom. These frames will stretch the width of the island and are the same length of the supports that will go in above, so I made sure to cut them to the same size at the same time. Since the dialing process was such a pain and just way too tedious, I'm going to glue and screw these together. However, I'm going to plug the holes since the whole thing is going to be primed and painted anyways. And I'll put those dowels to good use. These are framed up really simple. 2 long parts, 3 short parts, butt jointed together, glued and screwed. I put an extra support in the middle along the vertical supports in the back to help prevent any sag over time. The whole unit gets chamfered edges to clean it up and soften the touch and feel. I also go through and sand these edges after I'm done chamfering them. That increases the touch and feel. The chamfered edges go everywhere on every piece that's going to be put together to create this entire unit. Just helps with the overall aesthetic of the project. Putting this together, it barely fit on my workbench, but I made it work. Using this little spacer block here, I set my spacing. Using the tape, I was able to identify where everything falls, so if it did slip, I would notice. Screw those little slat holders in place. Flipping this over on my tiny little workbench was a little scary, but it worked out okay. Next, it's time for everybody's favorite tool, the pocket hole. I'll screw out some pocket holes here and hold this whole thing together with glue and pocket holes. Lots of pocket holes. Now I clamp it all together and using these pipe clamps. Then with the pocket hole screws, screw those together for a nice tight fit while that glue bonds and dries. Did I mention I used a lot of pipe clamps? Because I did. Now for the center support for the upcoming drawer section, I'm going to go ahead and glue and clamp this in place using some scraps to align it best to the center. And then I'm just going to screw in from this top support here in the front and again in the back. There will be a couple of pocket holes as well to hold it nice and tight and snug in place. Now to cut every one of these nearly 40 slats tediously to the same shape and sand them. I am not kidding, there are 40 of these. I started by cutting them all to the exact same width. However, the ones on the ends will get trimmed down a little more narrow to make up for the math problem I had when designing this. You see, I could have cut each of these strips to an exact width of 2 inches and some crazy fraction, or I could cut them all to 2.5 inches, slightly wide for the final fit. Then trim the outside ones to the same width to compensate for the gaps. This made it so that the center slats lined up dead center, and then all the other slats fell off of that one with an exact same gap. For the lower section, I had to trim a few of the slats a 1/4 inch shorter, not narrow, but long, so that they didn't stick out the front. See, this is due to the supports that I added in the back side. All the slats sit with a 1/4 inch reveal along the back and front. Rather than try and cut and shape these slats to fit snugly along those supports, I just cut them off flat. Nobody's going to see it. Let's face it, no one will even know they're shorter. In fact, I regularly mix them up with the longer ones. Well, I know you and I know, but don't tell anyone. I finished these with Rubio before attaching them so I could easily get between them and all over and around. I just taped off the areas that were going to be glued to the supports so that they adhered better when it was time for a glue up. Now, this is my first time using Rubio, but I'm a believer now. I was the one who always said poly and varnishes are great for everything and who needs Rubio? Well, I was wrong. If you're going to be touching it or close to it, if you're using any wood worth highlighting, go for the hard wax oil finish. The luster, the feel, and that overall appearance are leagues above anything poly and varnish will do. And it was easy to use, a lot easier than poly or varnish. No having to worry about dust or bugs or anything getting into it while it dries. Just plan ahead so that you're not dealing with a lot of corners and crevices to have to work into. Hence, I left assembly until after I finished these. It's an order of operations thing you just have to think through. It really is just wipe on and wipe off. Do a second coat if you feel it's necessary. To attach these with non-visible fasteners, because the goal here is a clean look, I cut 2 strips per set to run underneath. I'll glue the slats to these strips and brad nail them together from behind to hold it temporarily while the glue dries. This is where it's very important to measure twice. You don't want some Brad screwing up all the work you've done when he bursts through the top like the Kool-Aid Man. These brads will rest about a 1/4 inch below the surface. They aren't for strength, they're just clamps, like I said, until the glue dries. The final slat panels will be attached to the island rails through these supports with some cabinet screws. But we'll get back to that in a moment. For right now, it's time for primer and paint on the whole unit. I went with a gray primer since the final color is going to be a dark blue. If any of the paint should chip to reveal the primer, it won't be a stark white, it'll just be this subtle gray. I chose to roll on the paint instead of spraying it. The project is fairly small and I didn't feel like getting all Dexter in the garage for a quick paint job. Besides, these little rollers do a great job. I had to keep turning the unit into the sunny side so that I could see if I was missing anything. When I did this, it was a full sunny day. This made me glad that I had the casters on my bench. It made it really easy for me to rotate the whole thing around. I just had to clear out a little bit of room in the dance floor for the tango. Speaking of, my friend loved my use of these removable casters on my workbench and asked me to incorporate them into their island. If the client wants spinning wheels, I'm going to find a way to make it happen. In addition to the casters, I also added some self-leveling feet to all 4 corners and in the middle of that slat stretcher so that everything remains level. Once painted, it was time to drop the top on this table and put the slats in place. I set the slat panels on the rails and spaced them out evenly. Then I sent some short cabinet screws through the inside to secure them. The top is that pre-made butcher block we talked about in the beginning. It's unfinished. My friend wanted a food-safe finish that they could prep meals on in the kitchen. Yet another reason I picked Rubio. It is food safe. So after sanding the whole thing to a nice 120 grit, smooth and friendly to the touch, I flipped the top and finished the bottom first. This should help with even moisture absorption and loss over time. Not that I think there's going to be much of a problem with stability in this pre-made top. It was quite dry when I received it, but at the least I wanted a consistent look and feel. Even if it was only an inch of underlap, when you run your fingers along the bottom, it should feel like the top. Then I flipped the top over and finished the other side. That's it. It was done. It was finished. Rubio, wipe on, wipe off. It's that simple. Really, the hardest part was flipping this top over, and even that wasn't too difficult since this is pretty light wood. Oh wait, I almost forgot about the drawers. I built these to fit and used a standard side mount slide. Yes, I know, undermounts are the superior choice of the online woodworker, and all YouTubers worship at the altar of Bloom. Believe me, I've used them. They are good. They just wouldn't work here. There's no bottom support. Well, that and I'm not monetized yet, so I'm not required to adhere to the maker video guidelines just yet. Also, I had these left over from another project and wanted to get them out of my shop. I'm not going to bore you with a drawer box video build, but I will show you how I made these different. One side will have spice rack organizers inside. I bought these off Amazon and they are an acacia wood, I believe. I cut them to a snug fit and added a sliver of plywood along the backside so they don't go sliding around when these drawers are pulled out. For the other one, I added power and caster storage. They wanted a place where they could charge devices, and I saw an opportunity to store the casters out of sight when not in use. This was just a few scraps of plywood cut to fit and held in place by a couple of cabinet screws. Best of all, if the client wanted to remove either of these or flip them to the opposite drawer, it could be done. Nothing is permanently affixed inside the cabinets. And that's it, a custom-built kitchen island. I've dubbed this one the Love Island. My friends will know why, and you don't need to. Just accept it. This is Love Island. Before I wrap this up, I'd like to take a moment and dedicate this video to my dad, the man who showed me how to swing a hammer and cut my first board. Like I said, as a kid, I would go around with my dad to odd jobs, fixing decks, cabinets, siding, whatever somebody needed done. I didn't really appreciate the education I was getting at the time, but I see now how it shaped the way I see everything. So thank you, Dad. Thank you for that. For me, when I think of my father, I think of that blue two-tone Dodge, Beach Boys, and sweet tea. On Christmas morning, we lost my dad. Now, he told me several times throughout my life he was proud of me. I heard the words he spoke, but the weight of them didn't hit me until recently. Every person my dad knew of me and the work I did through him. Everything I've done, everything I've posted online, he showed them. So whenever I met people for the first time, they knew who I was because of how proud he was of me. I just hope he knows how proud I am of him. Showing up every day, working hard, and always being there whenever we needed him. Thank you, Dad.